The hospital was full that afternoon. People moved in and out, some with worried faces, others with hope that they would find healing. Nurses rushed through the hallways, carrying files and calling names, while patients waited in long lines. In the middle of this busy crowd, a small voice rose above the noise. Ifema was only 8 years old, but her courage was greater than her size. She stood at the edge of the corridor, her small hand clutching the torn hem of her dress. Her eyes searched for someone, anyone, who could save her mother. When she saw a tall man in a white coat walking with confidence, people moving out of his way as if he were too important to disturb, she gathered her strength and ran toward him. "Please, sir," she cried, pulling gently at the edge of his coat. Her voice shook, but her words were clear. "My mother is very sick. She will die if no one helps her." The man stopped. It was Dr. Kelechi, the most respected doctor in the city. He was not just a doctor, he was a billionaire who owned hospitals, clinics, and businesses across the country. People called him proud and untouchable. Some said he no longer cared for the poor, only for the rich who could pay. That was why everyone around was shocked when he stopped walking and looked down at the girl. The crowd grew quiet. Nurses who had been rushing slowed down to watch. Patients whispered among themselves. "Is that child talking to Dr. Kelechi? How dare she?" But Ifema did not notice their stares. Her tears rolled down her cheeks as she held onto his coat like her life depended on it. Kelechi looked at her carefully. Her hair was rough, her dress was faded, and her eyes were filled with both pain and determination. Something in her face pulled at him, something he could not ignore. He bent down slightly so he could meet her gaze. "What is your name, little one?" he asked gently. "Ifema," she whispered. "My mama is sick. Please, help her." For a moment, Kelechi said nothing. He was used to people begging him for favors, for money, for jobs. He had learned to harden his heart against cries and pleas. But this was different. The child's voice carried no selfishness. It was not for herself that she begged, but for her mother. Behind them, someone muttered, "Doctor, don't waste your time. She is just one of those poor street children." Another added, "There are too many like her. You cannot save them all." But Kelechi ignored their words. He kept his eyes on the girl, and he felt something stir inside him, something he had buried long ago. He remembered when he was a boy, barefoot and hungry, with a sick mother he could not save. That memory flashed before him, and he felt the weight of it press against his chest. He placed a hand gently on Ifema's shoulder. "Where is your mother?" he asked. Ifema's eyes lit with hope. She pointed toward a small corner of the hospital where her mother, Chiamaka, lay on a wooden bench, too weak to move. Her skin was pale, and her breathing was slow. A few nurses passed her without even looking, assuming she was just another poor woman who could not pay for treatment. Kelechi straightened and walked with Ifema toward the bench. The crowd parted, whispering as they watched the billionaire doctor follow a ragged little girl. Some were amazed, others jealous, but all were curious. When Kelechi reached the bench, he saw Chiamaka lying there, her eyes half closed. Ifema knelt beside her mother and shook her gently. "Mama, the doctor has come," she said softly. Chiamaka opened her eyes weakly, and when she saw the tall man in the white coat, she tried to sit up but could not. Her voice came out faint. "Please, sir, do not mind us. We have no money." Her words struck Kelechi even harder than Ifema's plea. Here was a woman ready to die quietly because she believed she had no right to care without wealth. He felt his throat tighten, but he forced his voice to stay calm. "You do not need money to deserve help," he said firmly. Ifema looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Will you help her, sir?" she asked again, as if making sure his heart had truly heard her. Kelechi nodded. "Yes, child. I will help her." The little girl burst into tears, but this time they were tears of relief. She pressed her face against her mother's hand and whispered, "Mama, God has answered us." The nurses nearby gasped. Never before had they seen Kelechi stop for someone so poor. He was known for his strict rules, for running hospitals like businesses, for charging high fees. Yet here he was, bending down to help a weak woman and comforting her daughter. Kelechi gave instructions quickly to the staff. "Prepare a room immediately. Bring the equipment. Start the treatment now." His voice was sharp, not with anger, but with urgency. The nurses rushed to obey. As they carried Chiamaka to a proper room, Ifema walked beside them, still holding her mother's hand. She looked back once at Kelechi, her small lips trying to form words. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you." Kelechi watched them go, and for the first time in many years, he felt something change inside him. It was not pride, not wealth, not power. It was something purer, something he thought he had lost when he became rich and distant. The busy hospital slowly returned to its noise, but whispers about the scene continued to spread. Some said the little girl's courage was a miracle. Others said the billionaire doctor had shown his hidden heart at last. Kelechi stood alone for a while, staring at the door where Chiamaka had been taken. He thought again of the girl's words, "Please, sir, my mother is very sick. She will die if no one helps her." Those words echoed in his mind, not as a cry of despair, but as a reminder of what he had once promised himself as a boy, that no one should ever be left to die simply because they were poor. And in that moment, Dr. Kelechi knew his life was about to change forever, all because of a daughter's plea. The clinic room was small and quiet, with only a single bed pushed against the wall. A thin curtain hung by the window, moving gently with the breeze. Chiamaka lay there, her body weak, her breathing shallow. Her skin was pale, and her lips were dry. Ifema stood beside her, holding her hand tightly, afraid to let go. Dr. Kelechi stepped into the room, his white coat brushing softly against the doorway. The nurses behind him looked confused. Some exchanged quick glances and whispered among themselves. "Why is the chief doctor here for a poor woman?" one of them murmured. Another shook her head, almost laughing. "This is strange. He never wastes time with people who cannot pay." But Kelechi paid them no attention. He walked straight to the bed, his eyes fixed on Chiamaka. For a long moment, he just looked at her, her tired face, her trembling fingers, the sadness in her eyes. He saw not just a sick woman, but the weight of years of struggle. "Bring me her file," he said firmly. A nurse hesitated, then rushed to hand him the thin folder. It contained almost nothing, only a few notes scribbled in ink. Kelechi scanned the paper quickly, then placed it aside. He bent down and checked her pulse, her breathing, her temperature. His hands were steady, but inside, something was stirring. Chiamaka tried to speak, her voice weak. "Doctor, please? I have no money. Do not trouble yourself." Her words pierced him. He straightened and looked at her. "You don't need money for me to treat you," he said calmly, but with strength in his voice. The nurses gasped softly. They could not believe what they were hearing. Was this the same billionaire doctor who was known for his strict rules, for charging high fees, for walking past poor patients without a word? They stared at him, almost waiting for him to change his mind. But he did not. He looked at his staff and said clearly, "I will treat her myself." The room fell silent. Even Ifema froze, staring at him with wide eyes. She had never expected such words. Slowly, tears filled her eyes, but this time they were tears of hope. The nurses shifted uncomfortably. One of them whispered, "But sir, this is not normal. You don't." Kelechi raised his hand, cutting her off. "Enough. Do as I say." His tone left no room for argument. The nurses bowed their heads and obeyed. They began preparing the equipment, bringing medicine, and setting up what was needed. Kelechi pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down. He placed his stethoscope gently on Chiamaka's chest and listened to her heartbeat. It was faint but steady. He checked her lungs, her blood pressure, her eyes. Finally, he looked at Ifema, who had been watching every move with anxious eyes. "She is weak, but she can be saved," he said softly. Ifema gasped and held her mother's hand tighter. "Did you hear, Mama? The doctor says you will be fine." Chiamaka closed her eyes, a small tear escaping. "God bless you, doctor," she whispered. Kelechi did not reply at once. Instead, he leaned back slightly and let his thoughts wander. For the first time in years, he remembered his own childhood. He saw himself as a small boy, barefoot, standing outside a clinic where his sick mother had once been refused treatment because they had no money. He remembered her tears, her pain, and the helplessness he had felt. That day had shaped his life. He had promised himself he would rise above poverty, that he would never let anyone treat him as less than human again. But in chasing wealth and respect, he had forgotten the real reason he had wanted to be a doctor, to save lives, no matter who they belonged to. As these memories came rushing back, Kelechi felt something heavy in his chest. He looked again at Chiamaka, a woman who could have been his own mother in another life, and at Ifema, whose courage reminded him of his younger self. He stood and turned to his staff. "Prepare everything. She will get the best care we can give." The nurses nodded quickly and began to work. Medicine was brought in, and 4 was set up, and the room filled with quiet activity. Kelechi guided them with skill, his sharp voice commanding but never unkind. Every detail mattered to him now. Through it all, Ifema stayed by her mother's side. She watched with big eyes as the doctor worked, her heart swelling with a mix of fear and gratitude. At one point, she whispered, "Thank you, sir. Thank you for not leaving us." Kelechi paused and looked at her. "You are brave, Ifema. It is because of you that your mother will live." Her lips trembled, and she hugged her mother's hand to her chest. Hours passed. Chiamaka received medicine, fluids, and careful monitoring. Slowly, color began to return to her cheeks. Her breathing grew easier, her body less tense. By evening, she was resting more peacefully than she had in weeks. Kelechi finally stepped back, exhaustion in his eyes, but relief in his heart. He had spent the whole day by her side, refusing to leave the room until he was sure she was stable. His staff watched him in silence, unable to understand this sudden change in the man they thought they knew. When the treatment was complete, Kelechi pulled the chair back and sat down again. He folded his hands, staring at Chiamaka. In her weakness, she still carried a quiet dignity. He admired that. He turned his gaze to Ifema, who had not moved from the bedside. "Your mother will need time to recover, but she will be fine," he said gently. The girl's face lit up with joy. She jumped forward and wrapped her small arms around his hand. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." Kelechi's chest tightened. It had been a long time since anyone had touched him with such pure gratitude. For a moment, he could not speak. Finally, he stood. "I will check on her tomorrow. She is safe here now." As he left the room, the whispers in the hallway grew louder. People could not believe what they had seen. The billionaire doctor himself treating a poor woman? Some thought it was madness, others thought it was a miracle. But Kelechi did not care what they said. As he walked down the corridor, he felt a strange peace, something he had not felt in years. It was as if the walls of pride and distance he had built around his heart were slowly beginning to fall. And all of it had begun with the courage of a little girl and the plea that had reached the part of him he thought was lost. The hospital days slowly turned into weeks. Every morning, Dr. Kelechi checked on Chiamaka. He monitored her treatment, asked the nurses for updates, and often stayed longer than expected, sitting quietly in the small room where she rested. Ifema was always there, never leaving her mother's side. Sometimes she read small storybooks to her, sometimes she simply hummed old songs, hoping the sound of her voice would bring comfort. The staff of the hospital could not hide their surprise. They had never seen Kelechi give so much time to one patient, especially one who could not afford a single coin. Some whispered that perhaps the girl's plea had touched him more than he wanted to admit. Others said he was hiding a secret reason. But Kelechi kept his thoughts to himself. He only knew that something inside him had changed. One evening, after a long day of surgeries and meetings, Kelechi returned to Chiamaka's room. The air was quiet, and the lights were dim. Ifema was curled up in a chair, asleep with her small head resting on her arms. Chiamaka sat up a little, looking stronger than before. Her face still carried signs of sickness, but her eyes were brighter. "You should rest," Kelechi said softly as he walked in. Chiamaka smiled faintly. "Rest is not easy when you have a child who worries too much." She looked at her daughter with gentle pride. Kelechi pulled a chair closer and sat beside the bed. For a few moments, silence filled the room. Then he asked, "Tell me about yourself, Chiamaka. What did you do before all this?" Her eyes clouded with memories. She hesitated, as if unsure whether to speak. But then her voice came, low and steady. "I once worked in a big house, many years ago. I cared for a family. The father was a strong man, and the little boy, he was lively, full of questions. I was only a maid, but I looked after him as if he were my own." Kelechi frowned slightly, curiosity stirring. "A little boy?" "Yes," she said, her gaze distant. "He loved to follow me around, asking about food, about stories, about life. I remember how he cried one day because he lost his shoes. I found them for him under a table, and he hugged me as if I had saved his whole world. His name was Kelechi." The doctor froze. His heart skipped a beat. He looked at her closely, studying her face, her voice, the kindness in her eyes. Memories rushed back, the smell of the kitchen, the sound of laughter, the gentle hands of a woman who had comforted him when he was small. "It was you," he whispered. Chiamaka blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" Kelechi leaned forward, his voice thick with emotion. "I was that boy. I was the child you cared for in my father's house. Do you not remember? You once worked for my family. You looked after me when my mother was sick. You held me when I cried. It was you, Chiamaka." Her eyes widened in shock. She studied his face, the lines of age and success, the strong jaw, the eyes she had once seen filled with innocence. Slowly, recognition dawned. She covered her mouth with her trembling hand. Kelechi, you are that boy? He nodded, his throat tight. Tears welled in Chiamaka's eyes. She shook her head, unable to believe the twist of fate that had brought them together again. I never thought I would see you again. Life took me far from that house. Hardship came, and I lost everything. I could not even dream that the boy I cared for would one day save me. Kelechi lowered his head, guilt rushing through him like a flood. All the walls of pride he had built over the years crumbled at that moment. This was no stranger lying in his hospital bed. This was the woman who had once shown him kindness when he was small and helpless. She had been like a second mother to him, yet he had not recognized her until now. He whispered, I should have known. I should have remembered you sooner. Chiamaka reached out with her weak hand and touched his arm. Do not blame yourself. You were only a child. And life has its own ways of bringing people back together. Kelechi looked at her hand resting on his arm, and for the first time in years, his eyes filled with tears. He quickly wiped them away, not wanting Ifema to wake and see him. But the weight of guilt pressed hard on his heart. You cared for me when you had so little, he said softly. And now, when you needed someone, you had nothing. Ifema had to beg me, not knowing that I already owed you more than I could ever repay. Chiamaka shook her head. What matters is that you helped. That is enough. But for Kelechi, it was not enough. That night, after leaving the room, he walked through the hospital halls in deep thought. His footsteps echoed against the walls, and his heart felt heavier than it had in years. He thought about all the patients he had ignored, all the poor people he had turned away because they had no money. How many of them had once shown kindness to others, just as Chiamaka had to him? How many lives had been left to suffer because of his pride? The discovery of who she was burned deeply into his soul. He realized that the very foundation of his success, the strength that had driven him to become the best, was built on the kindness of people like her. Without her care, without her gentle hand guiding his childhood, he might not have survived the pain of losing his own mother. As he stood alone in the empty hallway, he whispered to himself, I cannot fail her again. The following days were different. Kelechi spent even more time in Chiamaka's room. He talked with her about the past, about the house she had once worked in, about the games he used to play, about the laughter they had shared. Ifema listened with wide eyes, amazed to learn that her mother had once been part of the life of the great doctor. Sometimes Kelechi would smile softly as he remembered, but always, beneath the smile, there was guilt. He knew now that healing her was not just a duty as a doctor. It was a debt he needed to repay, a wound in his own heart that had to be mended. One evening, as the sun set and golden light poured through the window, Kelechi promised her quietly, You will not suffer anymore, Chiamaka. I will make sure of it. For all the kindness you gave me when I was a child, I will give it back to you and your daughter. Chiamaka's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they were not tears of pain. They were tears of peace. She nodded slowly, whispering, God works in mysterious ways. Kelechi sat in silence beside her, feeling the weight of her words. The discovery had shaken him deeply, but it had also opened his heart. He knew now that this meeting was no accident. Fate had brought them together again, not as master and servant, not as doctor and patient, but as two souls bound by kindness and gratitude. And in that moment, Kelechi understood, his life, his wealth, his success, it all meant nothing if he could not use it to honor the people who had once lifted him when he was weak. Chiamaka's health began to improve slowly, and each passing day brought new hope. Her once pale face gained color, and her weak voice grew stronger. Ifema, who had spent many nights crying beside her mother, now smiled more often. She followed Dr. Kelechi everywhere, asking questions, telling him little stories, and sometimes even holding his hand as if she had known him forever. The nurses noticed how much he had changed. This was not the same Kelechi who walked past the poor without a glance, who only treated those who could pay. Now, he was spending his time sitting with a woman who had nothing to offer in return. He ordered special meals for Chiamaka, made sure she had the best medicine, and even bought new clothes for both mother and daughter. One afternoon, Kelechi came to their room carrying two small bags. He handed one to Ifema and one to her mother. These are for you, he said simply. Ifema opened the bag quickly and gasped. Inside were neat school uniforms, books, and shoes. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with joy. Is this for me? Truly? Kelechi smiled. Yes, Ifema. You will go to school again. I will pay for everything. You must study hard and make your mother proud. The little girl leaped forward and hugged him tightly. Thank you, doctor. Thank you, she cried, her small arms holding him with a love that no amount of money could buy. Chiamaka watched with tears in her eyes. For so long, she had worried that her daughter would grow up without education, trapped in the same circle of poverty. Now, hope was shining before her, and it came from the boy she had once cared for long ago. Later that evening, when Ifema had gone outside to play, Chiamaka looked at Kelechi. "You have done more for us than I ever imagined." "Why?" she asked softly. Kelechi sat down, his face thoughtful. "Because you once gave me kindness when I had nothing. And because your daughter reminded me of something I had forgotten, that life is not about what we keep, but about what we give. She begged me to help you, even though she was just a child. Her faith, her courage, it touched me. It woke something inside me." Chiamaka nodded, moved by his words. "She has always had a strong spirit. Even when we had nothing, she never stopped believing things could get better." As days passed, the bond between the three of them grew stronger. Ifema began to call him Uncle Kelechi, and sometimes even teased him like a father. She would run to him whenever he entered the room, telling him about her dreams of becoming a doctor or a teacher one day. Kelechi found himself smiling more than he had in years. His heart, which had been hardened by wealth, power, and pride, was softening. He no longer cared about the whispers in the hospital halls or the questions from his rich friends. People said, "The billionaire doctor is wasting his time on a poor woman and her child." Others mocked quietly, "Maybe poverty has finally caught him." But Kelechi did not listen. For the first time in many years, he felt a joy that money could not give him. He realized that his mansions, his cars, and his accounts had never filled the emptiness in his heart. Yet the simple smile of a child and the quiet gratitude of a mother were now bringing him peace. One day, Ifema brought him a small flower she had picked outside the hospital. It was not bright or expensive, just a little wild flower. She placed it in his hand and said, "This is for you, Uncle Kelechi. You make my mother smile again." He stared at the tiny flower, and his chest tightened with emotion. "Thank you, Ifema," he whispered. "This is worth more than gold." The change in him was clear to everyone. His assistants noticed he was less strict, more patient. He began to treat poorer patients with more care, sometimes even paying their bills in secret. Nurses who once feared his sharp words now found him speaking gently, asking them to show compassion. One evening, Kelechi sat by Chiamaka's bed while she rested. He watched her breathing steadily, her face peaceful. Ifema was asleep beside her, curled up with a blanket. In that quiet moment, Kelechi felt something he had not felt in a long time: contentment. He thought about his life, about all the years he had chased wealth, thinking it would bring happiness. But now, sitting in a small hospital room with two people who had nothing, he finally felt rich in a way he had never known. When Chiamaka woke and saw him sitting there, she smiled faintly. "You look different, Kelechi," she said softly. "Different?" he asked. "Yes. Happier. Like a man who has found peace." Kelechi took a deep breath. "Maybe I have. I used to think joy came from building hospitals, from being the best, from being powerful. But now I see, real joy comes from giving, from helping. From seeing you and Ifema smile." Chiamaka's eyes shone with quiet tears. "You are changing, Kelechi. And it is a beautiful change." The days turned into weeks, and Chiamaka's health grew stronger. Soon, she could walk around the hospital garden with Ifema, holding her hand. Kelechi often joined them, and together they would sit under a tree, talking about life, the past, and the future. The whispers in the city continued, but Kelechi did not care. He had found something greater than the approval of the world. He had found a family he did not know he needed, and a purpose that wealth alone could not give. For the first time in years, he was not just a billionaire doctor. He was a man whose heart had been healed by kindness, by love, and by the simple faith of a little girl. And in those quiet moments with Chiamaka and Ifema, he knew his life would never be the same again. The day came when Chiamaka was strong enough to leave the hospital. Her face was no longer pale, her steps were steady, and her eyes carried hope instead of fear. Ifema walked proudly beside her, holding her hand tightly. Dr. Kelechi had been waiting for this day, and he had made a decision that would not only change their lives but also touch the lives of many others. He invited them to stand with him at a press conference in the hospital's main hall. Journalists, photographers, and city leaders filled the room, whispering among themselves. Everyone wanted to know why the billionaire doctor, famous for his wealth and strictness, was standing with a poor woman and her little daughter. The cameras flashed as Kelechi walked to the microphone. He placed his hands gently on Chiamaka's shoulder and looked down at Ifema, who clung to her mother's dress but smiled bravely at the crowd. Kelechi took a deep breath, and the hall grew silent. "Today," he began, his voice calm but strong, "I am not here as a doctor of wealth or power. I am here as a man who has been changed." The reporters leaned forward, curious. He continued, "A few weeks ago, a little girl tugged at my coat. She begged me to save her mother. That child had no money to give, no promise to make, nothing the world counts as valuable. But she gave me something greater, her faith. She believed I could help. And because of that plea, I found a part of myself I thought was lost." He paused, his eyes softening as he looked at Efima. "That girl's name is Efima. And this woman beside me is her mother, Chiamaka. They reminded me that compassion is more powerful than riches. Because of them, I stand here to announce something new." The hall buzzed with whispers, cameras clicking non-stop. Kelechi raised his hand for silence. "I am creating a foundation, the Efima Foundation, for free healthcare to the poor and forgotten. No mother will be turned away. No child will be left begging for help. This is not charity, this is duty. For true healing begins with compassion." The hall erupted with gasps. Reporters shouted questions. One asked loudly, "Dr. Kelechi, why now? Why this change?" Kelechi smiled gently, something rare for him. "Because it was not only Chiamaka who was healed. I was healed too. It was a daughter's plea that opened my eyes. She did not just save her mother, she saved me as well." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then, the applause began, first soft, then rising like a wave until the whole hall was filled with the sound of clapping hands. Cameras flashed even brighter, capturing the picture of the billionaire doctor standing with the once poor woman and her daughter. Chiamaka, who had been quiet, whispered to him, "You did not have to do this for us." Kelechi turned to her and shook his head gently. "I did not do this only for you. I did it because you showed me what I had forgotten. You showed me that the value of life is not in how much we keep, but in how much we give." Efima tugged at his sleeve and whispered, "Uncle Kelechi, does this mean many children will not cry anymore?" He bent down, looking into her wide, innocent eyes. "Yes, Efima. Many children will smile again because of you." Her small face lit up with joy, and she hugged him tightly. The cameras caught that moment, and soon the entire city saw it printed in newspapers and shown on television screens. The image of a billionaire doctor kneeling to hug a little girl became a symbol of hope. In the days that followed, the story spread across the land. People whispered in buses, markets, and offices, "Did you hear about Dr. Kelechi? The little girl's plea changed his heart." Others said, "This is a miracle. Who would have thought the richest doctor in the city would give free healthcare to the poor?" Patients who had once feared entering hospitals now walked in with courage. Mothers carried sick children, believing help was waiting. Fathers who had once lost hope came forward, thankful for the chance to see their families healed. The Efima Foundation grew quickly. Clinics were built in villages, mobile vans traveled to remote places, and medicines were given freely. Kelechi worked harder than ever, but this time with joy, not pride. He often told his staff, "Remember, we are here because a little girl believed in kindness. Never forget that." Chiamaka, no longer weak, stood beside him in many events, helping to comfort families. She spoke softly to mothers, telling them that no situation was hopeless. Efima, now in her neat school uniform, often ran through the hospital halls, her laughter filling the rooms with warmth. One evening, after a long day, Kelechi sat in his office. The city lights shone outside his window. On his desk lay a small wildflower, dry now, but still precious. It was the flower Efima had once given him. He picked it up gently and smiled. "This is where it began," he whispered to himself. For the rest of his life, he never forgot that moment, the tug on his coat, the tearful eyes, the simple words, "Please, sir, my mother is very sick." That plea had changed not only Chiamaka's life but his own. And so their story lived on, told in villages and cities, carried in newspapers and on radio shows. People spoke of the billionaire doctor who was saved by the courage of a little girl. They said, "True healing begins not with medicine, but with compassion." And whenever Kelechi heard those words, he only smiled, for he knew they were true. It was not wealth that had made him rich, but the love and faith of a child. It was not power that gave him strength, but kindness. And it was not success that gave him peace, but compassion. That was the true shock, not just to the city, but to his own heart. And from that day on, the land never forgot the lesson of a daughter's plea.